A black cowgirl was dared to calm a raging bull for $1 million, a cruel joke meant to humiliate her in front of everyone. But what she did in the next 18 seconds wasn't for money. It was the first shot fired in a war for justice that would bring a powerful ranch to its knees. The foreman laughed, pointing a thick finger at her. "Calm Titan for $1 million, or you're off my land for good." He expected her to run. Instead, she nodded once, her eyes fixed on the beast, and stepped over the railing. When she placed a hand on the bull, the world went silent, and the foreman's smile vanished instantly. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about noise and power, but about quiet courage. Before we uncover what happened next, please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and comment with your city and the word justice to show your support. Your engagement helps us bring these incredible narratives to light. The scene was the annual Lone Star cattle auction in rural Texas. The air was thick with dust, the smell of livestock, and the palpable tension of high-stakes bidding. Wealthy ranchers in crisp Stetsons and polished boots filled the stands, their eyes glued to the prize of the day, Titan, a Charolais bull worth more than most of the homes in the county. He was a mountain of muscle and fury, his horns sharp enough to tear through steel. Maria, a ranch hand in her late 20s, stood near the pens, her presence a quiet contrast to the loud, boastful men around her. She had worked this land her entire life, her knowledge of the animals and the earth passed down from her grandmother, a woman who knew the old ways of healing and understanding the wild. The problem started when a gate latch failed. With a deafening roar, Titan burst into the main corridor, scattering handlers and sending panicked buyers scrambling for safety. The bull was a whirlwind of destruction, his massive body slamming against the metal fences, his hooves tearing up the ground. The auction ground to a halt. Chaos erupted. That's when Jebediah, the ranch foreman, saw his chance. He was a man hardened by prejudice, his authority built on fear. He despised Maria, not just for her skin color, but for the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, a dignity he could never break. He strode forward, a cruel smirk on his face, and issued his impossible challenge loud enough for everyone to hear. $1 million, Maria. Tame the beast or get out. Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a death sentence disguised as a bet, but Maria's calm was unsettling. She didn't see a monster. She saw a terrified animal trapped and confused. Her victory in that pen would be more than just survival. It would become the leverage she needed to demand a change that had been denied to her community for generations. The confrontation was no longer about a raging bull, but about a system of oppression that had ruled these lands for far too long. Her actions would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a dark secret hidden within the ranch's history, a secret Jebediah and his employers would do anything to keep buried. Jebediah thought he was making a simple, cruel bet to put a black woman in her place. Was he actually handing her the very weapon she needed to dismantle his entire world? The laughter died down to nervous whispers as Maria swung her legs over the metal fence. She landed softly in the dusty corridor, the only thing between her and 2,000 pounds of panicked animal. Titan's eyes were wide, white with fear, and he let out a low, guttural snort, digging a hoof into the dirt. Jebediah crossed his arms, a smug look cemented on his face. He expected screams. He expected failure. He was already planning how he would tell the story of the arrogant cowgirl who got what she deserved. Maria didn't move toward the bull. Not at first. She stood perfectly still, letting the animal see her. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a handler with a prod or a rope. Her posture was open, her hands loose at her sides. She took a slow, deep breath, and then another. It was a technique her grandmother had taught her. Match your own calm to the chaos around you. The world of panicked shouts and scrambling ranchers seemed to fade away. There was only her and the bull. Titan watched her, his massive head lowered. He was still a coiled spring of power, but his frantic movement ceased. He was focused, Slowly, she took a step, then another. She moved on a slight curve, never approaching him head-on, an act the bull would interpret as a challenge. The crowd held its breath. A few ranchers who had initially laughed now watched with a grim fascination. They had worked with cattle their whole lives. They knew this was suicide. Jebediah's smirk wavered for the first time. This wasn't the terrified reaction he'd anticipated. Maria began to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound, more a vibration in her chest than a melody. It was the same sound her grandmother used to soothe spooked horses and calm birthing cows. It was a sound of the earth, steady and constant. Titan's ear twitched. He huffed, a blast of hot air clouding the space between them. But he didn't charge. He was listening. She was now within 10 feet. She could feel the heat radiating from the animal's body, smell the scent of its fear. She extended a hand, palm down, a gesture of peace. This was the most dangerous moment. One wrong move, one flicker of fear in her eyes, and he would trample her into the ground. She kept her gaze soft, focused on the thick muscle of his shoulder, not his eyes. Direct eye contact was a threat. The clock started ticking in the minds of everyone watching. 5 seconds. 10. She was now close enough to touch him. Titan shuddered, his hide twitching as if to shake off a fly. Maria's hand moved with impossible slowness until her fingers made contact with his coarse hair. The bull flinched violently, letting out a sharp bellow. A gasp went through the crowd. Jebediah took a step forward, a flicker of alarm crossing his face. But Maria didn't pull back. Her touch was firm, steady. She slid her hand up his neck toward the base of his skull. Her grandmother had shown her the spot, a small cluster of nerves where tension gathered in all living things. It wasn't magic, it was medicine. It was an intimate knowledge of life itself. She applied gentle, steady pressure. 18 seconds. Titan's massive head drooped. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lungs. The tension in his body visibly drained away, his muscles loosening like a rope going slack. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment. The raging beast was gone. In its place was just an animal, tired and calm. The silence in the auction house was absolute. It was heavier and louder than the previous chaos. No one moved. No one spoke. Maria gave the bull one last, reassuring pat before turning around. She walked back toward the fence, her expression unreadable. She climbed out of the corridor with the same quiet grace she had entered it. She stood before Jebediah, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. The crowd was staring at him now, not her. The power had shifted. "Dumb luck!" Jebediah spat, his voice hoarse. "Pay her the damn money and get her out of my sight." He gestured for one of the owners to write a check. "I don't want your money," Maria said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent arena. Jebediah froze. "What? $1 million is nothing," she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "It's an insult. You wanted to see a miracle, Jebediah. Now you're going to pay for it. I want a school, right here on this land. A school that teaches our kids everything from soil science to the old remedies. A place where their knowledge is valued, not mocked." She pointed a finger, not at him, but at the community of ranch hands, black, white and Latino, standing in the background. "You will fund it. That's my price." Jebediah's face turned a shade of mottled purple. A vein throbbed in his temple. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. "A school? Are you insane? You think you can waltz in here, pull a lucky stunt, and start making demands like you own the place?" He took a step toward her, his posture aggressive. "You get the money, or you get nothing. Now choose." But Maria's gaze wasn't on Jebediah anymore. It was sweeping over the crowd, over the faces of the wealthy bidders in the stands, and settling on a man in the front row who had not moved an inch during the entire spectacle. He was older, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place among the denim and leather. This was Arthur Caldwell, the owner of the entire Lone Star ranching empire. He was the man who signed Jebediah's paychecks. He was the real power. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Cell phones were out, recording. The potential for a PR nightmare was growing with every second Jebediah spoke. Caldwell understood this. He raised a single placid hand, and Jebediah's ranting stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The foreman looked like a dog called to heel, his anger replaced by a sullen obedience. Mr. Caldwell descended the steps from the VIP box with a deliberate, unhurried pace. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. He stopped a few feet from Maria, his eyes assessing her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. "That was quite a display, young lady," Caldwell said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Truly remarkable. Jebediah made a public offer. The ranch will honor it. A check for $1 million is yours." He gestured to an assistant who was already pulling out a checkbook. It was a dismissal, an attempt to end the scene and regain control. "I already gave my answer," Maria replied, her voice steady. She didn't raise it, but it cut through the arena's silence. "The price isn't money." Caldwell's polite smile tightened at the edges. "A school is a philanthropic endeavor. A noble idea, certainly, but it is not the payment for a wager made in the heat of the moment." "It wasn't a wager," Maria corrected him. "It was a challenge. Your foreman challenged me to do the impossible in front of all your business partners. I did it. Now you will honor the price I named." She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only Caldwell and a fuming Jebediah could hear. "Or the story of the day won't be about the prize bull. It'll be about the rich rancher who goes back on his word in front of the whole state of Texas." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He saw she wasn't bluffing. She wasn't intimidated. This was no longer about a bull. It was a negotiation, and she had just laid her cards on the table. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones still pointed their way. He had to take this out of the public eye. "And where, exactly?" Caldwell mused, feigning casual interest. "Did you have in mind for this school?" Maria pointed toward the low-lying hills to the east of the auction grounds. "There, on the old Henderson plot." The reaction was instantaneous. Jebediah flinched as if struck. Even Caldwell's practiced composure broke for a fraction of a second. His eyes went cold. That piece of land was fallow, unused for anything but grazing. To an outsider, the choice was random. To them, it was a direct threat. "That land is not suitable," Jebediah interjected, his voice strained. "It's unstable." "It's fine," Maria said flatly, her eyes locked on Caldwell. "My great-grandmother was born on that plot. My family worked that soil long before it was called the Lone Star Ranch. It has deep roots. It's the perfect place for something new to grow." She was no longer just a ranch hand. She was the descendant of people they had displaced. She was dredging up a history they had worked very hard to bury. The demand for a school on that specific piece of land was not a random request. It was a targeted reclamation. It was a claim. Caldwell stared at her for a long moment, the gears turning behind his cold, calculating eyes. He had underestimated her completely. This wasn't about a moment of bravery. It was a planned attack. He had to get her away from the crowd, shut down the narrative she was creating. "My office," he said, his voice dropping to a low command. "We will discuss the terms of your donation now." He turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. He hadn't agreed to her terms. He had simply changed the battlefield. The fight was moving from the open arena to a closed room, where he held all the advantages. Or so he thought. Undefined, Maria followed Caldwell, with Jebediah trailing behind them like a guard dog. They left the dusty, chaotic world of the auction yard and entered the main ranch office, a modern building of glass and steel that felt like an alien structure on the Texas plains. The air inside was cold, sterile, and smelled of polished wood and money. Caldwell's office was a cavernous room with a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the vast expanse of his land. On the wall hung a massive framed map detailing every acre, every well, every fence line of the Lone Star Ranch. The Henderson plot was a small, insignificant-looking square on the eastern edge. Caldwell sat behind a desk the size of a small car and gestured for Maria to take a seat in a leather chair that was clearly designed to make a visitor feel small. Jebediah stood by the door, arms crossed, his presence a silent threat. "All right, miss." Caldwell paused, realizing he didn't even know her last name. "Flores," Maria supplied, her voice even. "Miss Flores," he continued, a thin smile playing on his lips. "Let's be pragmatic. A school is a complex venture. There are zoning laws, construction permits, educational board approvals. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. I am prepared to make a substantial 7-figure donation to the county education fund in your name. It will do far more good, and you will be hailed as a hero." He folded his hands on the desk, his tone suggesting the matter was settled. "The price is the school, on that land," Maria said, unmoved. "I'll handle the bureaucracy. You just provide the funding and the deed." Caldwell's smile faded. "That land is not for sale. It is not available. It has geological issues. It's the same geology as the land 100 yards to the west, where you have 100 head of cattle grazing," Maria countered. "The ground is solid." Jebediah shifted his weight by the door. "Listen to the man, girl. He's trying to help you." Maria ignored him, her eyes fixed on Caldwell. "You're not worried about the ground. You're worried about what's in it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Caldwell's mask of civility slipped, revealing the cold, hard businessman beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm offering you a fortune, a life-changing amount of money. Take it, and you can build your school anywhere you like. This is my final offer, and this is my final answer," Maria said. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper, handling it with care. She unfolded it on the polished desk. It was a hand-drawn map, brittle with age, showing the layout of a small homestead. It was dated 1923. In the corner, in faded ink, was the signature of her great-grandfather, Elias Flores. It was a copy of the original property lines of the Henderson plot, before it was absorbed by the expanding Lone Star Ranch. "My grandmother kept all the old records," Maria said softly. "She said to never forget where we came from. This map shows the location of the old well, the family garden, and the family cemetery." Jebediah's face went pale. Caldwell stared at the map, his expression unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. An unofficial, unmarked cemetery on his land was a legal and logistical disaster. Building a school would require surveys, excavations. Things would be found. "This is a meaningless piece of paper," Caldwell said, his voice dangerously low. "It has no legal standing." "Maybe," Maria agreed, carefully folding the map and putting it away. "But it's a good story. And I have a feeling the local news would love to hear the story of the ranch that bulldozed a family's history to hide a few graves, especially after your foreman made such a public spectacle." It was a checkmate. Caldwell was trapped between a PR disaster and a potential legal quagmire. He stared at her, a new, grudging respect mixing with the pure venom in his eyes. She had come prepared. This was never about the bull. "Get out," he finally said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We will have our lawyers draw up a preliminary proposal for a land lease. Not a deed, a lease. Don't push your luck." Maria stood up. "I look forward to reading it." She walked out of the office, past a seething Jebediah. As the heavy door closed behind her, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The first battle was won. But as she stepped back into the hot Texas sun, Jebediah was right behind her. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel. "You think you're clever," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You have no idea what you just started. That land needs to stay buried. You keep digging, you're going to find something that will bury you too." He shoved her away and stormed off. A few minutes later, as she was walking near the workers' quarters, An old ranch hand named Samuel approached her. He was a man of few words who had worked for the ranch for 50 years. "Heard what you did in there," Samuel said, his eyes kind but weary. "And what you asked for." He looked toward the Henderson plot in the distance. "Your grandmother was right to tell you about that place, but she probably didn't tell you everything. It ain't just your family buried out there, child. There are others, people the ranch wanted forgotten." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Be careful." The bull was the easy part. Samuel's warning echoed in Maria's mind for days. The initial euphoria of her victory at the auction had evaporated, replaced by a cold, watchful tension. True to his word, a packet arrived from Caldwell's legal team a week later. It was a 99-year land lease agreement for the Henderson plot, drafted on thick, expensive paper. The terms were restrictive, filled with clauses that gave the ranch oversight on construction and the right to terminate the lease for any number of vague violations. It was a cage disguised as a gift, but it was a start. It was a foothold. Word of her stand had spread through the workers' quarters like wildfire. Some slapped her on the back in quiet solidarity, their eyes shining with a hope they hadn't felt in years. Others avoided her gaze, their fear of Jebediah and Caldwell stronger than any admiration. They knew that a nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The community she was fighting for was both her greatest strength and her most vulnerable point. "They're watching you," Samuel told her one evening as they finished their shifts. "Every move. Jebediah's got a couple of the younger hands reporting back to him. Be smart." Maria just nodded. She knew. She could feel Jebediah's eyes on her whenever she was in the open, a simmering hatred that promised violence. She spent her evenings in her small, inherited cabin at the edge of the ranch property, poring over her grandmother's old books and papers, searching for anything that could explain Samuel's cryptic warning about others being buried on the Henderson plot. The cabin was more than a home. It was an archive of her family's history, filled with journals, remedies, and the faded photographs of ancestors who had worked this same unforgiving land. The turning point came on a moonless Tuesday night. A storm was rolling in, the air heavy and charged with electricity. Maria was woken from a restless sleep, not by thunder, but by the frantic barking of her dog, Buster. Then she smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of gasoline and smoke. She threw open her door, and her blood ran cold. An angry orange glow was visible over the rise, in the direction of her cabin. She didn't even stop to put on her boots. She ran, her bare feet pounding against the hard-packed dirt. The glow grew brighter, the smell of burning pine and history choking the air. When she cleared the last hill, a wave of heat hit her, and she stopped dead. Her cabin was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno that lit up the night sky. The roof was already collapsing, sending a shower of sparks into the wind. Everything was gone. Her home, her grandmother's journals, her family's past. Jebediah's threat rang in her ears. "You keep digging, you're going to find something that will bury you too." This was his answer. This was his attempt to erase her, to burn her history off the face of the earth. Tears of rage and grief streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. She just watched the flames consume her world. By dawn, there was nothing left but a smoking, blackened square on the ground. A few other ranch hands came to stand with her in silence, their faces grim. The sheriff's department came and went, calling it faulty wiring, a tragic accident. No one believed it, but no one would dare say otherwise. As the last of the embers cooled, Maria walked through the wreckage. She was numb. She poked through the charred remains with a stick, searching for anything salvageable. It was hopeless. Then the stick hit something hard under the collapsed floorboards. Metal. Her heart hammered in her chest. She fell to her knees, ignoring the soot and sharp debris, and began digging with her bare hands. She unearthed a small fire-blackened metal strongbox, warped by the heat, but still intact. It was the box her grandmother had always kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, the one she called her insurance. With trembling hands, she pried the damaged lock open. Inside, miraculously protected from the fire, was not just her family's papers. There was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. It was a logbook, written in her great-grandfather's neat script, from his time as a foreman before the Caldwells took over. It listed names, dozens of names of migrant workers from the 1920s and 30s. And next to at least a dozen of those names were two words: work accident, followed by a location. Every single location was a set of coordinates within the Henderson plot. It wasn't a cemetery, it was a dumping ground. Jebediah hadn't just burned down her house to scare her. He had been trying to destroy the evidence of a century-old crime. The fight was no longer about a school, it was about murder. Clutching the ledger, Maria felt the last of her grief burn away, leaving behind something cold, hard and sharp. The fire hadn't buried her past. It had unearthed a truth far darker than she could have imagined. Jebediah and Caldwell weren't just bullies who stole land. Their empire was built on the bones of forgotten men. The school was no longer just a project for the future. It was now a monument to the dead, a reckoning for the past. She wrapped the strongbox and its precious contents in a spare horse blanket from the stables, the only place she could find temporary shelter. Her first and only stop was Samuel's small bunkhouse room. She found him sitting on his cot, cleaning a bridle, his face etched with worry. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes fell to the soot-stained bundle in her arms. He didn't need to ask. Maria closed the door behind her and placed the box on his small table. She opened it and pushed the ledger toward him. "You were right," she said, her voice raspy from smoke and emotion. "It wasn't just my family." Samuel opened the book. His gnarled fingers, accustomed to leather and rope, traced the names written in the faded ink. He read a few of the entries, his lips moving silently. A deep, weary sigh escaped him. He looked up at Maria, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I knew it was bad," he said softly. "I didn't know how bad. My uncle, his name is in here." He pointed to an entry from 1931, Mateo Rivera. Work accident. The shared history of their pain sealed their alliance. This was personal for him now too. "They think they destroyed the evidence," Maria said, her voice gaining strength. "They gave me the one thing I needed to burn them to the ground." "A book isn't enough, child," Samuel warned. "It's 100 years old. Their lawyers will tear it apart, call it a forgery. It's your great-grandfather's word against the Caldwell name." "I know," Maria said. "That's why the school has to be built. We have the lease. We have a legal right to be on that land. We're not just going to lay a foundation for a building. We're going to conduct an archaeological survey." The next day, Maria walked into the main yard with a confidence that startled everyone. She was homeless, wearing borrowed clothes, her face and arms still smudged with soot, but she walked like she owned the place. Jebediah saw her and strode over, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "Tragic accident about your place," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Faulty wiring, they say. Good thing you weren't in it." It was a confession and a threat rolled into one. Maria met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, it was a tragedy. I lost so many things. But it's amazing what you can find in the ashes when you look hard enough." Jebediah's smirk faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected tears, fear, retreat. He didn't understand the woman standing in front of him. "You should have taken the money when you had the chance," he growled, turning away. His overconfidence was a mistake. The fire, meant to isolate and terrify Maria, had the opposite effect on the community. Seeing her cabin reduced to cinders was the final straw for many of the workers. That evening, a small group of them, Latino, black and white hands who had been on the ranch for years, approached Maria and Samuel at the stables. "We heard the sheriff's report. We know it's a lie," one of them, a young man named Carlos, said. "My family has a spare room. You can stay with us. You're not alone in this." It was the beginning of a quiet rebellion. Caldwell and Jebediah had ruled by fear, but by being so blatant, so cruel, they had shown their hand. They had turned Maria from a troublemaker into a symbol. A week later, Maria walked back into Caldwell's sterile, air-conditioned office. She placed the lease agreement on his polished desk. It was signed. Caldwell looked surprised. "I expected more negotiations," he said, picking up the document. "More demands." "There's only one demand," Maria said, "and you've already agreed to it. The land. We'll be breaking ground as soon as the permits are approved." "Excellent," Caldwell said, leaning back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. He thought he had won. He had contained the problem. He had given her a worthless piece of land and a restrictive contract. And in return, he had avoided a PR disaster and silenced a nuisance. He believed the matter was closed. "I'll need full access for my survey team, of course," Maria added casually as she turned to leave. "Geological surveyors, historical preservation consultants. You know, we want to make sure the foundation is solid and that we don't disturb anything of historical significance. It's all in the lease." Caldwell's smile froze. He looked down at the lease his own lawyers had drafted. They had included standard clauses about due diligence and site surveys to protect the ranch from liability, never imagining those same clauses would be used as a weapon. He had just handed her a signed permission slip to excavate his family's darkest secret. As Maria walked out, she knew the real war was about to begin. They had the motive and the map. Now, thanks to Arthur Caldwell himself, they had the key to the crime scene. Caldwell didn't yell after Maria left. He didn't throw anything. He simply sat at his desk in the chilling silence, the signed lease feeling like a death warrant in his hands. He had built an empire on the principle of control, and for the first time in his life, a ranch hand with nothing to her name had taken it from him. He picked up the phone, his movements precise and cold. "Sheriff Thompson," he said into the receiver, his voice dangerously calm. "Arthur Caldwell, I have a small matter regarding some new land permits. I need them reviewed thoroughly. We can't have any procedural mistakes." The message was clear. Bury them in red tape. Maria knew what was coming. Caldwell's power wasn't just in his wealth, it was woven into the very fabric of the county, from the sheriff's office to the zoning board. She couldn't fight this battle with righteous anger alone. She needed a different kind of weapon. That night, staying in the spare room at Carlos's family home, she used their old dial-up internet connection. She didn't search for lawyers who charged by the hour. She searched for university law clinics and non-profit groups, organizations that fought for the forgotten. Her email, a simple, direct account of the situation, received a reply 2 days later from the Texas Justice Initiative. A week after that, a dusty sedan pulled up to the ranch workers' quarters. A young man in a slightly too large suit stepped out looking completely out of place. This was David Chen, a junior lawyer with the initiative, barely older than Maria herself, with eyes that burned with an idealistic fire. They met in the stables, the smell of hay and horses, a stark contrast to the legal documents David spread out on a crate. Samuel stood nearby, a silent, watchful presence. "The lease is ironclad," David said, tapping a paragraph with his pen. "He gave you the right to survey, but he's already moving against you. I called the county clerk's office about the survey and excavation permits. They've been flagged for environmental review. That could take months, years even. So we're stuck," Maria said, the frustration evident in her voice. "Not necessarily," David countered. "This ledger," he pointed to the fire-scorched book Maria had entrusted to him. "It's a historical document. The names, the dates, they correspond with the disappearances of migrant workers from that era. This isn't just a land dispute anymore. It's a potential mass grave. We can petition a federal judge on the grounds of historical preservation and potential criminal investigation. It takes the power out of the hands of Caldwell's local cronies." This was Maria's growth. She was learning to translate the language of her ancestors, the language of the earth and its secrets, into the language of her enemies, the law. The fight moved from the dusty ranch to a war of paperwork and legal motions. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Caldwell's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to drown them in delays. Jebediah and his loyalists made their presence felt, their trucks always parked just a little too close, their stares lingering a little too long. The psychological pressure was immense, but the community, once fractured by fear, was now galvanized. Samuel used his decades of knowledge to help David build a historical case for the land, providing affidavits about the families who had lived and worked there. Carlos and the younger hands organized a neighborhood watch, making sure Maria was never alone, documenting every instance of intimidation by Jebediah's men. They were no longer just workers, they were a unit. They were overcoming the fear that had kept them silent for so long. The breakthrough came in a small, stuffy courtroom in a nearby city. A federal judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense reputation, listened to both sides. Caldwell's lawyer painted Maria as a disgruntled employee on a vindictive crusade. David Chen, in his ill-fitting suit, simply presented the facts. The ledger, the fire, the history of the land, and the blatant obstruction by the county. The judge's ruling was swift. The historical implications of this case are significant. The petitioners have a right to determine what is on that land. The permits will be expedited. Any further attempts to delay this process will be met with severe sanctions. It was a stunning victory. Caldwell had been beaten in his own arena. The following Monday was a cool, clear morning. A white van from the State University's archaeology department rolled down the dirt road toward the Henderson plot. Maria was there to meet them, along with Samuel and David. As the team began unloading ground-penetrating radar equipment, Maria looked out over the overgrown field. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing a piece of land. She was seeing the final resting place of people whose stories had been intentionally erased. Her victory was not a moment of celebration, but one of solemn purpose. She had won the right to unearth the truth. As she took her first step onto the plot, ready to guide the archaeologists to the coordinates from her great-grandfather's ledger, she saw a glint of light from a ridge half a mile away. It was Jebediah's truck. He was watching through binoculars. The legal battle was over. The physical one was about to begin. The ground-penetrating radar looked like a futuristic lawnmower, and the lead archaeologist, a woman named Dr. Elani Davis, pushed it in precise, overlapping lines across the dry Texas soil. Maria walked beside her, holding her great-grandfather's ledger, pointing out the areas where the coordinates were clustered. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming heat of the day. Jebediah's truck remained on the ridge, a silent, menacing sentinel. "He's not just watching," Samuel said, his voice low. He, Carlos, and a half-dozen other ranch hands had formed a loose perimeter around the survey site, their presence a clear message. They weren't armed, but they were not going to be intimidated. "He's waiting." The radar machine beeped intermittently. Dr. Davis watched a small screen, her expression focused. "The soil here has been disturbed," she said, pointing to a section of the field. "Repeatedly. There are anomalies beneath the surface. Consistent with unmarked graves." Every beep from the machine was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of the Caldwell dynasty. Maria felt a grim satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by the weight of what they were doing. This wasn't just about winning, it was about honoring the dead. As the sun climbed higher, a second truck appeared on the ridge next to Jebediah's, then a third. Soon, there were nearly a dozen of them, forming a line. They were Jebediah's loyalists, the men who benefited from his brand of cruel authority. They weren't just watching anymore. They were gathering. David Chen nervously checked his phone. "I've called the sheriff's department again. They said they'd send a car to keep the peace, but they haven't shown up." "They're not coming," Maria said flatly. "They work for Caldwell." She looked at the line of trucks, then at her own small group. The archaeologists were scientists, not fighters. David was a lawyer. It was her and the other ranch hands against whatever Jebediah was planning. The radar beeped loudly, a solid, undeniable tone. Dr. Davis stopped and marked the spot with a small orange flag. "We have something significant here, about 6 feet down. The density is consistent with human remains." It was the first confirmed discovery. The moment the flag was pushed into the earth, the engines on the ridge roared to life in unison. It was a declaration of war. The trucks began to move, not down the road, but directly over the rough terrain, bouncing and rumbling as they descended the hill toward the Henderson plot. They were coming to stop this, by force if necessary. "Get the equipment back in the van," Maria yelled to Dr. Davis. "David, call the state police, the FBI, anyone who isn't on Caldwell's payroll. Tell them there's an armed mob obstructing a federal court order." The archaeologists scrambled to pack their sensitive gear. Maria, Samuel, Carlos, and the others stood their ground, forming a human chain between the approaching trucks and the flagged grave site. They were unarmed, facing down a dozen 2-ton steel machines. The lead truck, Jebediah's, came to a screeching halt just 20 feet from them, kicking up a cloud of dust. The other trucks fanned out, surrounding the small site. Jebediah climbed out, a tire iron in his hand. His face was a mask of pure rage. "This is your last chance, Flores," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the rumbling engines. "Pack up this circus and get off this land. This is a private property dispute, nothing more." "This is a crime scene, Jebediah," Maria called back, her voice shaking but clear. "And you're about to add obstruction of justice to the list of charges." "There are no charges," Jebediah sneered, taking a menacing step forward. "There's just you, me, and a whole lot of empty land. No one's going to find you this time." It was a slip, a confession made in anger. He wasn't just talking about the historical crimes anymore. He was talking about the fire. He was talking about what he planned to do right now. But just as he took another step, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't a truck engine. It was the distinct thrum of a helicopter. Everyone looked up. A news chopper from a San Antonio station was descending, its camera lens pointed directly at them. David Chen, holding up his phone, had a triumphant look on his face. "I didn't just call the police," he shouted over the noise. "I called every news outlet in the state. Smile for the camera, Jebediah." The foreman froze, the tire iron hanging uselessly in his hand. His face, caught in the harsh morning light and the unblinking eye of the camera, was a picture of trapped fury. The cavalry hadn't arrived in the form of police cars, but in the court of public opinion. The standoff was now being broadcast live across Texas. The game had changed once again. The physical intimidation had failed. Now, all that was left was the truth, buried just 6 feet below the surface. The presence of the news helicopter changed the dynamic instantly. Jebediah and his men, who thrived in the shadows and ruled through fear, were now exposed. Their raw aggression looked brutish and criminal under the glare of a live news feed. Jebediah looked up at the chopper, then back at Maria. His face a storm of indecision. He was a cornered animal. He could retreat and lose, or he could double down and become a villain on the evening news. Before he could make a choice, the wail of sirens finally cut through the air. Not the lazy siren of the local sheriff, but the urgent overlapping calls of state trooper cruisers. Within minutes, the field was flooded with official vehicles. The state police, responding to a call about armed interference with a federal order and likely spurred on by the live news coverage, had arrived in force. Jebediah's mob, which had seemed so intimidating just moments before, now looked like a pack of cheap thugs. They slowly got back into their trucks, their bravado gone. Troopers began questioning them one by one, their tire irons and angry shouts now evidence in a serious investigation. But the real climax wasn't happening in the field. It was happening back at the main ranch house. Arthur Caldwell had been watching the news feed from his office, his face growing paler with every passing second. He saw the standoff. He saw the state troopers arrive. He saw his carefully constructed world of denial and control shatter in high definition. The secrets his family had killed to protect were about to be dug up on live television. He made one last, desperate move. He walked out of his office and got into his own pristine pickup truck. He didn't drive toward the Henderson plot. He drove toward the main gates. He was running, but Samuel, wise to the ways of cornered men, had anticipated this. He had quietly radioed Carlos, who had peeled off from the main group moments before the troopers arrived. As Caldwell's truck sped down the long driveway, he saw another ranch truck parked sideways, blocking the main gate. Carlos was standing in front of it, his arms crossed. Caldwell slammed on his brakes. He laid on the horn, a furious, impotent blast. Carlos didn't move. Caldwell got out of his truck, his expensive suit now rumpled, his face a mask of aristocratic rage. "Get out of my way, boy," he screamed. "This is still my property." "Not for long," Carlos said, his voice calm but firm. "You have to answer for what your family did, for what you did." Caldwell looked around wildly. He was trapped. Behind him, the flashing lights of an approaching state trooper car reflected in his rearview mirror. In front of him was the unmoving resolve of a man he had never even bothered to learn the name of. The rancher who owned thousands of acres was cornered on his own driveway. Back on the Henderson plot, the scene was now orderly and official. The archaeology team, protected by a line of state troopers, began the delicate work of excavation at the flagged site. Maria stood beside Dr. Davis, watching as they carefully removed layers of soil. The news camera kept a respectful distance, but was still rolling. It didn't take long. A little over an hour into the dig, one of the technicians stopped. "I've got something," she said softly. Dr. Davis took over with a smaller trowel and a brush. Slowly, carefully, she brushed away the last of the dirt. First, a piece of rotted fabric appeared. Then, the unmistakable curved shape of a human skull. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. It was real. The ledger was real. The stories were real. Samuel put a hand on Maria's shoulder, his grip tight. Tears streamed down his face as he thought of his lost uncle, Mateo. Maria felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sorrow. This was the truth she had been fighting for. The skull was not just evidence, it was the remains of a human being, a worker who had a name, a family, a life that had been stolen and discarded like trash. A state trooper approached Maria, his expression grim. "Ma'am, they've apprehended Arthur Caldwell at the main gate. He's being taken into custody, and Foreman Jebediah is under arrest for aggravated assault and obstruction. They want to know if you can identify him as the man who threatened you." Maria looked from the unearthed grave to the distant figure of Jebediah being placed in handcuffs. Her personal vengeance felt small, insignificant, compared to the justice she had just unearthed for the dead. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with the weight of a century of silence. "I can." The arrests of Arthur Caldwell and Jebediah were the lead story on every news channel in the state. The live footage from the helicopter, a line of ranch trucks facing off against a small group of unarmed people protecting a grave, was played on a loop. The narrative that Caldwell had tried so desperately to control was now a raging wildfire of public outrage. The Lone Star Ranch, once a symbol of Texan power and prosperity, was now known by a new name whispered in headlines and news reports: the Ranch of Bones. In the days that followed, the Henderson plot was declared a protected historical and criminal site. Dr. Davis's team, now working under the full authority of the state, unearthed more remains. Each discovery was a new tragedy brought to light. They found 12 bodies in total, their resting places perfectly matching the coordinates in Elias Flores's ledger. Forensic analysis confirmed they were from the correct time period, and many showed signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with work accidents involving heavy machinery or a foreman's brutal fist. The ledger, once a private family document, was now the state's most important piece of evidence. Jebediah, stripped of his power and authority, crumbled in the sterile environment of an interrogation room. His lawyer advised him to stay silent, but his rage and self-pity were too strong. He tried to paint Maria as the villain, an agitator who had destroyed a good thing. But when presented with the evidence of the fire, gasoline residue found at the scene, witness accounts of his truck being near her cabin that night, he broke. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he confessed everything. He admitted to setting the fire, claiming Caldwell had tacitly approved it. He told them Caldwell knew about the graves his entire life, referring to the Henderson plot as the family's dirty little secret. Arthur Caldwell's fall from grace was swift and total. The powerful friends who once flocked to his auctions now refused to take his calls. His bank accounts were frozen as part of the ongoing criminal investigation. The Lone Star ranching empire, built on a foundation of bones and secrets, began to collapse under the weight of its own history. The man who ruled a county was reduced to a prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, his tailored suits replaced by cheap cotton, his legacy turning to ash. The real vengeance, however, came not from a prison sentence, but from the law itself. A month into the investigation, David Chen met Maria and Samuel by the now fenced-off Henderson plot. He was holding a thick legal document. "It's over," David said, a look of awe on his face. "It's more than just murder charges for Caldwell's ancestors and accessory charges for him. The state is arguing that for nearly a century, the Lone Star Ranch has been a criminal enterprise, using violence and intimidation to acquire land and conceal crimes. They're filing a RICO case." Maria looked at him, not quite understanding. "What does that mean?" "It means," David said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "that under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the state can seize all assets associated with the criminal enterprise." He paused for effect. "They're seizing the entire ranch." The words hung in the air. Samuel stared at David, then at Maria, his mouth agape. This was a consequence they had never dared to imagine. Their fight for one small plot of land had brought down the entire kingdom. "The Caldwells will lose everything," David continued. "The land, the cattle, the name. The state will likely auction it all off to pay for the investigation and to create a restitution fund for the victims' families." This was the ultimate revenge. It wasn't just about putting two evil men in jail. It was about wiping their corrupt legacy from the land itself. Maria looked out across the vast expanse of the Lone Star Ranch. She saw the rolling hills, the grazing cattle, the foreman's house on the ridge. It was all built on pain, but the land itself was innocent. "Can we buy it?" Maria asked, the question so audacious it surprised even her. David blinked. "Maria, it's tens of thousands of acres. It's worth hundreds of millions." "With the restitution fund," she pressed, a new fire in her eyes. "With public donations. We could form a community land trust. The families of the people who worked and died here, we could give it back to them." The school was no longer the end goal. It was the beginning. The dream had exploded from a single classroom into a vision for a new community, built on justice instead of oppression. The vengeance was not in destruction, but in reclamation. They would not just build a school on the Henderson plot. They would transform the entire Lone Star Ranch into a place of healing, education, and true community ownership, forever erasing the stain of the Caldwell name. 2 years later, the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. The name Lone Star Ranch was gone, scrubbed from maps and road signs. In its place was a new name, the Flores Rivera Cooperative, a community land trust managed by a board of directors. Maria Flores was the chairperson. Samuel Rivera was the head of ranching operations. Carlos was in charge of land management, and David Chen, now a senior partner at his non-profit, sat as their permanent legal advisor. Maria's audacious idea had become a reality. Fueled by national media attention, the restitution fund, and a flood of public donations, the trust had successfully bid for the seized assets in the state auction. They didn't just buy a piece of the ranch, they bought all of it. The land was finally back in the hands of the community whose ancestors had bled and died for it. The Henderson plot was no longer a field of secrets. It was a memorial. 12 simple carved stones stood in a quiet grove of oak trees, each bearing the name of a man recovered from the earth. Mateo Rivera's stone was visited often by Samuel, who would leave a single wildflower, a silent communion with the uncle he'd never known. Where Jebediah's house once stood on the ridge, there was now a new structure. It was a school, just as Maria had demanded, but it was so much more. The Flores Rivera Agricultural and Heritage School was a state-of-the-art facility that combined modern agricultural science with the traditional knowledge Maria's grandmother had passed down. Children learned about soil chemistry in a lab, and then learned how to read the land for medicinal herbs on a nature walk. They learned veterinary science and the quiet art of animal husbandry that Maria had used to calm a raging bull. It was a place where their heritage was not a historical footnote, but a living, breathing part of their future. Caldwell's opulent main house had been transformed into the cooperative's administrative building and a community center. His office, once a symbol of cold, absolute power, was now a public library. The massive window that once allowed him to look down upon his kingdom now allowed the children of ranch hands to look out at their shared future. Arthur Caldwell died in prison of a heart attack 6 months into his 30-year sentence for racketeering, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. He died a forgotten man, his name a byword for disgrace. Jebediah was serving a 15-year sentence for arson and assault. He would be an old man when he got out, returning to a world where he held no power, where the people he once terrorized now owned the very land he stood on. One crisp autumn afternoon, Maria stood on the porch of the new school, watching a group of children learning about cattle rotation from Samuel. She was no longer just a ranch hand. She was a leader, a builder, a keeper of memory. The fire had taken her home, but from the ashes she had built a home for hundreds. The cruel challenge at the auction seemed like a lifetime ago. The $1 million prize was a pittance compared to what she had won. She hadn't just tamed a bull, she had broken a dynasty. She hadn't just demanded a school, she had reclaimed a legacy. Her quiet courage in that dusty arena had started a revolution that rippled through generations. The vengeance she achieved was not the bitter kind that leaves one empty. It was the deep, satisfying justice of planting a new garden where weeds once grew, of building a future on land that had finally been cleansed of its past. The air no longer smelled of just dust and livestock. It smelled of hope. Maria's story is a powerful testament to the idea that true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about restoring what was broken and building something better in its place. It all began with a cruel public dare meant to humiliate her. $1 million to do the impossible. But what unfolded from those initial 18 seconds of impossible calm was a reckoning that money could never buy. She faced down a raging bull, a corrupt system, and the violent hatred of powerful men, not with weapons, but with the quiet strength of her convictions and the unshakable truth of her history. Jebediah and Caldwell ruled with loud, brutal force, but Maria's quiet, steady resolve proved to be the more powerful weapon in the end. This story reminds us that the past is never truly buried. The secrets we think are hidden beneath the surface have a way of coming to light, and the courage of one person can be the spark that illuminates a century of darkness. Maria didn't just seek revenge in its simplest form. She sought a deeper, more meaningful restoration. She didn't just want to tear down the old world built on fear. She wanted to build a new one founded on respect, knowledge, and community. The Flores Rivera Cooperative stands today not just as a successful ranch, but as a living monument to the forgotten. It is a powerful testament to the fact that no injustice is too old to be righted, and no power is too great to be challenged when confronted with the truth. Her initial demand for a school evolved into something far greater, the complete reclamation of a legacy, turning a graveyard into a garden for future generations. What do you think about Maria's incredible journey? Many stories of revenge end with the villain's downfall, but this one went a step further. Do you believe true justice requires this kind of rebuilding, or is seeing the bad guys lose enough? What part of Maria's final victory resonated most with you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage and redemption. The world is full of stories like this, where the underdog finds the strength to change everything. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of truth and justice, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more narratives that matter. Every like, every comment, and every subscription sends a message that stories of courage and integrity are what people want to see. It allows our team to find and produce more narratives like Maria's, stories that don't just entertain, but also inspire. And if you stayed with us until the very end, we want to give you a special thank you. Let us know you're part of our dedicated community by commenting, "I watched until the end." The fight for justice takes many forms. On your screen now, you'll see a link to another one of our most powerful stories about an individual who stood up against impossible odds. We think you'll find it just as compelling. Click on it to continue watching, and we'll see you in the next video.